Welcome back to On Patrol podcast. I am Wyndehust Productions, joined as always with
Fightin Kentuckian.
and we are back for episode 10. But before we get into what this episode's about, as we always like to do, we like to start off with our alibis, caveats, and piggybacks. Don't have a lot from myself this month, other than, as you've probably noticed, it's fairly late in the month when this episode comes out. It's been a busy one for us. Last month was great. We got to do our episode 9 in person for our year in review. But yeah, a lot of holiday stuff going around, and I know Kentuckian, you had some work-related stuff keeping you busy. Any alibis, caveats, piggybacks for you?
Well, first of all, you're a bald-faced liar. That's how I like to start out this episode. We go into December. We talk about where we're going to go. We talk about how far can we stay on azimuth. And as true with all wargamers, Wyndehust sends me messages and pictures of 2 new rule sets that he bought that were not discussed in his azimuth changing. And I myself personally have been flirting again with getting Shakos and bayonets. I know, Wyndehust, at this moment you have Blood Red Skies is what I'm tracking, and Shakos and bayonets sitting in your house. Is that correct?
I've got the rules. Now, I always had the Blood Red Skies models, but hey, Warlord, if you're listening, it would be nice to have a starter set with the Jet Age so we don't have to buy a bunch of World War II planes to get all the nice rule sets and accessories you do. But yeah, you kept talking about how great the rules were and how good the game is, and I finally was like, okay, I blame you for that one. That one's your fault.
I will take that. And again, as we can, I made a foundry order. I think since we'd last done episode 9, and in that foundry order, maybe a few, 25, 28 millimeter Napoleonic slipped in there to include Napoleon and Ney in them. So, Shakos and bayonets, who knows, it might be coming. Just like you said, extremely busy, after late December, and then kind of getting back into the battle rhythm in January. I went TDY out of state a lot for the military. I'm about to go TDY again coming up here for like the next 2 weeks. So the hobby time has come to a screeching halt. I had family and stuff visit, but I'm looking at maybe getting 10 models painted in January, and that's probably not going to happen. So a screeching halt. I got more work done when I was, when we had the break there and everything. So I look forward to hopefully getting back to that. But my year is not looking good as far as the work product for the hobby is coming out. And then again with the league pending, I really need to get on to painting those U.S. Airborne. I appreciate everybody that commented, left me messages, had a lot of good people talk about how I was going to get those stuff painted. But I have noticed too, Wyndehust, like another little alibi and caveat for you is you are cranking away on your World War I stuff, so that's pretty impressive as well.
Yeah, I've got them all.
We're getting
all
there,
primed.
right?
Yeah, I got them all primed. People might have noticed I've started on that epic French army, which I kind of hadn't planned. I don't think I mentioned it when we talked in December. Mm-hmm. But I did say in December that I'm open for things popping up, and this was one of those situations where it felt like the right thing to do to shift this project to the fore. Because I feel like it's for a good cause, so that's kind of taken over everything.
No, that is awesome. And if anybody hasn't followed his page, it's again, he's got a website up there where he's donating money to MS. He has already recruited me to paint. The feeling of this blanket that I feel kind of collapsing over me right now is shame, because I need to get started on that as well. I told him that would be a good ideas, as people donate money, that's the amount of miniatures that he needs to paint, and he is just absolutely crushing it right now, doing a lot of good techniques, speed painting for those epic minis, and they look impressive right now. And as you continue to go on, I can't remember if it's the one that I like that you did the Zenithal highlight yet with the white or the black. I'll have to go back and look through, but a lot of good stuff, and I know you're receiving a lot of good help. There are people that are commenting techniques, and you've already even done a great work on the reference material, and I know you've sent me a bunch when I finally start mine. So that should be it for us. We really, again, check out Wyndehust page for the MS donations, and I'm thinking about dropping a few $100s towards him just because I want to see him paint like mad.
Let me get caught up a little bit first.
So that's a great thing. But any other last minute alibis, caveats, or piggybacks from you, Wyndehust?
Nope, you can lead us right on into the depths.
Okay, so if you looked at the headline of this episode, in this episode, we're going to talk about why is historical wargaming controversial? Question mark. And again, we know a lot of other pages and topics and discussions from both sides of the aisle have really attacked this, but we wanted to, Wyndehust Productions and I are going to dive into the world of controversy with historical wargaming, but we'd like to venture into this topic with the lens of respect and deference to the opposing sides by allowing taboo topics to kind of be discussed in detail. Our overall goal is not to offend anyone who's listening. So if we say something that you feel is offensive or can be taken out of context, from the outset, we want to apologize. But when you're discussing material that is definitely delicate, that is something that may happen. But we want to show these opposing viewpoints and their reasonings and rationale. And our ultimate goal, if you stay along with us, is we want to see where is the line in historical wargaming, especially for these controversies. So, without further ado, into the deep dark woods of this, grab your spear, your shield, your musket, or your belt-fed machine gun, and join us on this episode of On Patrol. So let's move out. Wyndehust, start us away.
All right. So this was a hard one for us to break down and figure out where to start. And we agreed that this first topic was probably the best area to talk about, and because it's kind of all-encompassing for all periods of historical wargaming. And that is the sanctity of human life. And how we aren't taking for granted when we're removing models from the table or placing casualties. And it's something that really sets it apart from your fantasy and sci-fi gaming, because none of those conflicts actually happened, and most historical games are either depicting actual combats, like actual battles, or possible battles from real periods where people's families and ancestors were in. And so how do we reconcile the sanctity of human life that we're representing on the tabletop? So with that, Kentuckian, I'll open it to you for your first initial thoughts. I know there's a lot to unpack here.
There is a lot to unpack, but we wanted to get down to kind of, even before we get to these conflicts that we fight, what they were fought over, and all of those ideologies, the simple truth is, when you're taking someone's life, right? No matter where we come from, me and Wyndehust again, Western cultures, right? Murder is a time a big issue, right? And when you're fighting you're a combatant in wartime, right? It's one of the only times where the taking of another human life can really be authorized by your own government, or what case may be. And again, not to kind of pull back the layers yet to say, well, was your government wrong? But to say that happens. I think whether we're removing models from the game, or you're looking at things that take a step back from just even historical wargaming and talk about books, movies, TV, computer games, where death is just a part of it. These topics are extremely interesting to people. They're prevalent in our everyday world, and so there's something to be said. We wanted to acknowledge the fact, well, you're just killing people in droves, or this actually happened, or is that being respectful of that person who passed away? And me personally, I don't see the difference in a video game that is playing World War II, that I think, Call of Duty and all of those things have obviously out there. No matter what, if you're a historical war game or not, you have the ability to see that, and whether it's depicted in movies and all of those things. To me, the sanctity of human life isn't like pushed aside or kicked dirt on or rocks on when you're just removing models from a table. That's no different for me to kind of reading about it and doing it. And I think, on the opposite side, there's people that are like, well, I don't want to play that, or I don't want to actually be involved in living that out. And no matter what media you're using, whether you're playing a tabletop war game or maybe watching a World War II movie, I think that can be sometimes a moving and shifting standard that somehow people can't wrap their head around. And unfortunately, based on human nature and the human condition, death and murder, even taking away the lines of people and their nations and what they're fighting for, is just it's part of life. And whether you turn on the 7 o'clock news or you do that happens. So for me, and what I see as maybe any type of wargaming model, that's not really a huge issue. I think one of the things that comes up here is that we'll get into later a little bit with depraved stuff actually happening on the tabletop, is this is just, it's as tied in to basically human life and our past, and unfortunately what we're seeing right now at our present. And so does that happen in war? Yes. Well, then automatically that has to be a part of the tabletop. There were me and Wyndehust did some net calls with just some various groups that we talked to, and there were a few people that responded back, like, at the end of the day, historical wargaming is, made up. It's a fantasy in some degree, right? Those battles and those fights have already happened. And there's like an idea that, okay, well, what if you played chess? What if these pieces were a pawn and a knight and a bishop and a rook, as opposed to a medium machine gun or a unit of hoplite spears and all of those things? The game, in some sense is no different, but what the representation is, does that help people make it remove to say, I lost my pawn, but I didn't just sacrifice, my foot guard? And to me, that's a little bit, I think, disingenuous to say that's the pot, that's equal, or that creates the separation. Because at the end of the day, the model that I did a crappy paint job on, as Wyndehust snickers at me, is not a living human breathing, maybe a human. It's supposed to represent, the person of the day and age. But I think the sanctity of human life, historical wargamers aren't just kicking dirt on it. Most of the historical wargamers are steeped in the history of what happened in their conflict and the amount of people that unfortunately perished, fighting for their side, their values, and their struggles. But that's how I see the sanctity of human life, and I just wanted to throw in some opposing views there. Wyndehust, what are your thoughts on that with the models on the table? People, and then the way that it can be skewed via whatever game you're playing.
Yeah, so, I mean, my personal experience and what I've seen with other historical wargamers, something to consider when considering the sanctity of human life and how we rectify that with tabletop wargaming, period. If we move the historical. If you're looking at, excuse me, non-historical games, you're representing things that aren't real. So if you want to throw away your units for a pointless charge, that's, because it's fun or whatever, that's fairly easy to do. But I feel like myself and the way I see other historical wargamers play, when those models look like real people, they're humans, and they often represent things that you see in media and your research, and, in all this reference material, and you might have ancestors or living family who are there. You're putting yourself most often not as the individual soldier like you would in a video game, but as the commander. And I think a lot of us historical wargamers, either consciously or subconsciously, are hesitant to waste our units because part of us thinks of them as people. Like, that's our army. Especially if you put the effort in painting it, you take pride in them, and the idea of wasting the lives of your men as the commander is kind of shunned and looked down upon. Like, that was a pointless charge that you did for no other reason than, wow, what else was I going to do? I don't see that happen very often in historical wargaming. And you and I had talked about.
Great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, continue. That's a great point.
Yeah, and And I think along with that, we've talked about using casualty models, and some people that seems a little graphic. But I like using them, and I'm starting to use them a good bit more after playing with you, because a part of me, I take it a step further than that. What I was saying prior, but if I did lose an entire division or an entire squad or entire platoon, that stings. It stings tactically, but also it's like that was a large loss of life, and I feel like I'm paying respect and acknowledging that was a mistake I might have made, and an error by putting casualty markers to be like, oh, well, they're not just gone and off the table, so it doesn't really matter. Who cares? I feel like I'm representing that was a loss of life, and that in some way connects me with the historical setting that I'm representing. Because I think a lot of historical wargamers, you get some who are very into their niche period, and that's all they care about. Or there's, individuals like me and Kentuckian who like a wide range of historical periods. And so we research into them, we look into them, we study them, we read the personal accounts of individuals, their diaries and their journals, to help shape our understanding of the conflict. And that very often translates itself even to the scenarios we come up with. A scenario that is showing the hardships and that these individuals had to overcome. So I think when it comes down to the sanctity of life and historical wargaming, I find historical wargamers in the hobby in general are much more aware and attuned to that element than maybe other gamers aren't, because it's very easy for them to dismiss, oh, well, this is entirely made up. The creatures and the factions I'm using don't exist and never have existed in the real world. So the loss of life is irrelevant. Whereas we are representing historical war games, quite often the actual loss of life that happened.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And I think going back to your casualty figures, I think me and you use that way, but I think it's good to hear, as we talked about, earlier in this episode, as we announced it, where the line is. And so me and Wyndehust, our goal is here to put kind of at least road signs down to where we see, I have heard people that just don't like it based on, they feel like it's not being, it has issues with the sanctity of life, that they're taking, gamers are taking lives for granted because the conflicts actually happened. And then I think you have on the, other side of the spectrum is, this is a way to kind of reflect, what actually happened. I would say those views, as what actually happened, can branch. I think there's a reverence that's made in people when they play the historical war game, that say, hey, just as you do, where, you're internalizing it and you're saying, we both do casualty figures. And again, I don't, I'm not putting a head out there or a leg or an arm and just saying that's it alone. But some of my casualty figures obviously have wounds, have damage, and they show, I just lost an airborne squad around this hedgerow. I'll put out 2 or 3 models and show, like, that's where that struggle occurred. That's where that happened. And that's where those soldiers, are obviously no longer part of my unit. But then, to cheapen it, I think, you could have some more of a game on it, where you're looking at it more of like chess. And, just like the knight or the pawn is going to get removed, so is the unit. And so, well, that's what did I just remove there? Was it a cohort? Was it a French battalion during Napoleonics or whatever? And we, Wyndehust and I, again, when we started this episode, we're not really kind of saying which is right or wrong, any viewpoint, but we definitely want to kind of roadmap that here are the opposing viewpoints, here are our initial thoughts on them. And again, based on what you see as controversial, I think there's a lot of ways to approach it to where you can still enjoy historical wargaming without crossing, whatever you feel is your line. What are your thoughts on that, Wyndehust?
Yeah, so it makes me think that, the type of tabletop war games, kind of more board games where you're using counters, I feel like people would consider less controversial than the type of tabletop wargaming we do, right, with models. And I think that's because we're actually depicting human beings versus just tokens. But they're ultimately both games, and I think that's a key thing to remember. Like, yes, both of us are representing a historical battle, but we're doing it for the enjoyment that it's a game. It's gamey. The rules are, I think one of the people you spoke with talked about, well, they're close approximations of historical periods where, we're using points and things. So, I mean, ultimately it is a game. And I think it's important for those who are concerned about how historical gamers are respecting life to remember that, they're games. But to see that most of us take the time to understand the conflict and the period, I think, on a greater level than the average non-wargamer would. And
yeah, and
respect
I
that.
totally agree. I'm up to 1 right now. That's what my ticker should say. But I totally agree with that sentiment, because the idea being is that, we're not just willy-nilly, is a word that keeps coming to my, or a phrase that keeps coming to my mind, like, we're just going to remove those models and that's it. There's some, obviously a lot of historical wargamers play that based on the period. We're not just going to pick up Monopoly or Sorry. Like, we enjoy that interesting period of history. We enjoy researching it, the development, the characters, the armies that fought in it. And so there is this, I think, reverence from people who play it for that sense, to where it's not just, models. You kind of get that feel of it. It's the same thing when you read the book about some of these larger than life people in history, or their units, and you're just like, wow, this is, they had to overcome so much, or they had to go through all of these gates to kind of develop to who they were, or, the tactical geniuses of the time and whatever else. And I think there's just like you said, there's this higher degree of kind of a reverence and respect for that when you're a historical wargamer, in my mind. Not to say that there's not people out there that, play the game in a different viewpoint than that. And, I honestly can't say that, there's a warmonger in there or something like that, just as though somebody wouldn't want to roll dice where a model is removed, kind of equaling someone's human life. And again, we're not pointing to any of these views being right or wrong. We're just showing that the difference in them, and then why some people, I think, from either side view that as, hey, that's wrong. Whatever you do, whether you think picking up dice to take a model's life is wrong, or whether you think that, laying down a casualty figure more than a chick counter game is the right way to do things, and anything else has just lessened it. I think there's a variety of viewpoints here, and we wanted to make sure that we aired them out and at least kind of stated their rationale and reasoning. And I think at least tell you where myself and Wyndehust are coming from when we're talking about human life. What other thoughts do you have on that, Wyndehust?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's something maybe we'll go over in more detail later, but we're trying to be respectful to both sides, and by both sides we mean those who are saying that this is a controversial point, and those who aren't. I would ask those who have issue with historical wargaming and feel like historical wargaming isn't respectful to human life, and say, we'll look at other forms of media. We mentioned in the beginning, movies and video games. Look at those. Look at historical films and video games ones set in those settings and ones that aren't, as well as look at other war games and see, like, do you feel that way about them? And if you feel that way about all of them, then to me that's your line, and I respect that. That for you, maybe representing death, either historically or non-historically, in and of itself for the purpose of entertainment, is not respectful. But if you don't have issues with it in that regard, then maybe take a second to really think, then why is it you might have issue with it in tabletop wargaming? And try and understand the perspective of those who are gaming it, and that, well, you enjoy the video game or you enjoy the film that depicts the same thing we're engaging in on a war game, and maybe see that they're really not that different. But I don't want to get into bashing other genres and everything. We might do that later.
No, that's well said. And I think pending anything else, I think we'll move on to the next topic here. The next kind of thing that we talked about, we've moved on from just removing models from the table. I think a highlight of this, and definitely will have a lot of meat on the bones, is wargaming controversial conflicts throughout history. Controversial is a word that is going to, it's definitely going to be mattered to the individual. But therefore, kind of how or why, or some people, seem to demonize wargaming more recent conflicts or conflicts that are closer to them, but forget how all warfare is kind of tied to conquest, ideologies, genocide, etc. No matter the period. Also noting how conflicts are linked throughout the ages and even perpetuate the future conflicts. So why do some people look down their noses kind of in playing World War II or even to modern conflicts, but have no problems with ancient armies, massacring entire nations? Or at least it's more palpable. And so here we kind of want to talk about through the ages. And I have wargamed a little bit of, I think, Bronze Age, a lot of Bronze Age and even a little bit prior to, but I think Wyndehust probably would be the lead on prehistoric and prehistoric wargaming. So I'll let you kind of lead us off here with, some of those games that you've played and around that system and what that's meant to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kentuckian. So I want to start off by kind of going at this from an initial point, this controversy. I think a lot of it stems from distance, and that's distance in time and history and distance geographically. So if we go way back, we're going to go back where it's the furthest distance for both of those for everybody. So we're going prehistory. So I do have a very large collection of, early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals for caveman. It's just a really niche area in wargaming that for some reason captured my focus, and I just love buying and painting them and occasionally getting them out for games. And so because that is an area in the hobby that I like to play as a historical wargamer, I have done a lot of reading about the prehistory and the development of humanity from a scientific perspective. And there were, if you look at it and you know anything about it, there were several species before you got to, I can't remember the scientific name, but the modern human. Well, the other ones just didn't die out by natural causes, right? It was a competition, and the winner was the one who was the smartest, who could beat the other ones to the resources or bred them out of existence. It was an ugly, nasty, brutal affair, and only one of those species survived, and guess what? That's all of us. I don't know anybody that has issue with wargaming that. It doesn't seem controversial, despite the fact that if you're going to put two different species together in a fight, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, you got to understand that historically their goal was very often the complete eradication of the other group because they're fighting over limited resources that they had available. Nobody had issues with that. I've never met anyone who had issues with that. Consider it a controversial topic. And I've played a lot of games with it. Even when it comes to, hunting mammoths and things, some people, if we acknowledge that there's a number of species that have gone extinct throughout history because we have hunted them to death, nobody has issues with wargaming, a mammoth hunt or anything like that. So I think maybe because it's so far removed, even though some topics are relevant, like the, extinction of animals due to human effects. I don't know. Nobody's ever had issues with that, seeing that on the table, and I've never heard of it. I don't know if you ever have.
I think controversial conflicts, I think like you said, is, and we have it here kind of in the notes, is proximity seems to be, the guiding light of why and why not, and is it respectful, for so recent to be here. And we wanted to make sure that we went that chronological. I think ancients and medieval you can kind of tie together, although that's blasphemy for a lot of those wargamers, myself included and yourself included. The idea of human history and conquest and what happened, looking at, from the Bronze Age all the way to kind of even late medieval. You have these boundaries on a map being created. You have religious wars, obviously, in there, whether you look at the Old Testament, whether you look at, even the New Testament, and kind of what's going on. Whether you have the Moors, you have the Spanish Reconquista, you have all of these things that are kind of tied to not only countries going to conquest, like even in the classical period with Alexander the Great, and what happened in there, but you also have them tied to, ideologies and genocide and the eradication of people. You could easily look during the ancient period of, the De Bello Gallico and Caesar, which one of the crimes, they were trying to put him back on trial for when he crossed the Rubicon was basically the genocide of the Gauls. And I think there's a lot of things where it might be people don't have the knowledge of it, or there is some, I hate to use the term right now, but revisionist history where we are taking like harder looks back at people and maybe their flaws, whether it be commanders, nations, or these countries. But I think they're tied to what obviously we have today. They happened, and there is, I think, I have to kind of include these together, just like what you were saying, for a more modern, whether you get to Black Powder period or even in Ukraine, and why do some seem more palpable than others? I think it's a super interesting topic to look at that, but I do think proximity is weaved in. So if you had an issue, that you were thinking about, like with, well, I can play Romans versus Barbarians, and I can play this thing, but I don't like playing, kind of what's happening now, or, more recent period. I do think that is just as Wyndehust said, everybody has their line, and it's fine to have wherever your line in the sand is. But I think going back to what is a historical wargamer? What are they trying to get out of the hobby? Myself personally, I have the viewpoint, and I know most historical wargamers are, let everybody, get along, live. It's a crazy world. There's some point to wargaming in itself is escapism to a degree, right? We are reading the books. We're doing a hobby that we are trying to get out of the period. Just if I wanted to game, I love the classical period, and Carthage, the Punic Wars. Carthage is eradicated, right? And that is just part of what comes out of it, and Rome is wanting to do that. And what happens to North Africa and that colony that started so long ago is gone and forever, right? Scipio Africanus comes out of that. That is just so interesting to me about the period, the people, the generals, the armies, everything that's in it. And obviously there were things that happened that I think in good conscience an average human being would be like, that's awful. That's what happened. But I think there is always this dark part of history, whether we're talking about Homo sapiens killing each other and eradicating each other, or whether we go to ancient medieval period, and then especially kind of the Crusades and the wars of religion and what happened with the sieges on those towns and those things. I think a lot of the stuff comes to what is the underlying purpose of these controversial conflicts. I think when I game ancients, I'm obviously not trying to like glorify the internal slaughter of people or genocide, which I know Alexander the Great here recently has come under a lot of fire for, especially his conquest of Persia. I think it's so beyond like novel and interesting that's how boundaries were created. That is how the human species dealt with each other at the time. These were people that actually lived. Your poetry, your art, your anything as far as helping the human race go forward is coming out of these times. I know me and you, when we talked about Syracuse and the Greek mathematician, I believe what is his name? Is it Archimedes?
Yeah, Archimedes for Syracuse.
Yeah. And so it's just, these are super tied in together. And I think my purpose when I'm saying that is, when I'm gaming Romans versus Gauls, is I'm not like, oh, okay, I hope all the French people die. Like, that's not it. This stuff really happened. It's so interesting to paint both of the opposing armies, to get tied into what their culture was, how their army was organized, who their leaders were, how they were dynamic against each other. To me, that is extremely, tied into why I pursue historical wargaming over anything else. The 40K universe, the make-believe lands of movies and TV that, whatever you watch, whatever you kind of peruse, this stuff really happened. These people really lived. These points, and these ideologies and these conquests, they died for these reasons. I don't really try to dive into, what I feel if everyone feels if they're right or wrong. I want to know them because this is part of human history as everything else is. And to me, there's no line in the sand on the 50,000 people that died at Cannae. That's awful. That is extremely 50,000 lives and souls snuffed out. But again, this is part of it. And I think most people, even the people that haven't been tied into historical wargaming, don't have issues with even leading up into those periods. What are your thoughts specifically on those periods, what you get out of them, and what you see people either having no issue or issues with when we're looking at maybe ancients and medieval, Wyndehust?
Yeah, so I was thinking, and for me, it seems like the first period that really, I would say the controversy comes out would be the Crusades. And, you and I talked when we were going over how we want to do this episode, that kind of what we're doing is, we want to hold up a mirror to you all listeners. And I'm going to point this mirror at both my fellow historical wargamers and those who, feel like, let's say the Crusades specifically are a controversial topic that shouldn't be wargamed. It was a period that interested me, and I admit that I didn't know much about. And I haven't wargamed it yet, but it is something like I built my Norman army because it could easily roll into the Reconquista and the First Crusade. So what did I do as a historical wargamer? I started listening to audiobooks, science books talking about, or historical books about the entirety of all the Crusades. Like I found a series of books that talked about every single Crusade, and it just blew my mind about how much I didn't know. And so I think the controversy around the Crusades comes from two main problems: ignorance and how it's been politicized. Because, bad people in the world might use the Crusades as a rallying call for their modern agendas, as well as use it as a rallying call, either for or against the Crusades as a rallying call. But I feel like, I had talked about this, I had posted some, kind of Crusader models I had painted. And someone made some comments about, where they should be sent in modern times. And I kind of messaged them and I was like, listen, like that comment had nothing to do with wargaming and what was going on. And I feel like historical wargamers, like if all you're seeing is a war between religions and the Crusades, then you haven't studied enough about it. You need to go and you need to look into the history, because it was way more complicated than that. It had very little to do with that. And get yourself learned. And I say the same thing to those who are looking at the Crusades and saying like, you all shouldn't be wargaming that. You just hate that other religion and you want them to die. Okay, well, maybe you don't also know enough about the history of it. Now, if that person is seeing like the person who commented, then okay, yeah, both of you are coming from a place of ignorance and you both need to learn something. But to me, like that's really the first period I have seen and witnessed controversy, and I feel like it's stemming from ignorance about the period and how little they know about it. And I feel like in general, the wargamers, because we do the research, because we want a force that represents, we realize that, those Crusader forces very often weren't all Christian. This was their real goal. It wasn't about eradicating another religion. It was about power and land grabbing and resources and economics and all these other factors. And why you had these battles, because we want to do these battles on the tabletop. Well, why did that battle happen? Okay, well, it's because they're going here, or, this was a major trade route and things like that. And so I really feel like a lot of times, even in later periods, the controversy is stemming around from ignorance. Those who are saying you shouldn't wargame that, they don't really understand the conflict like a lot of us historical wargamers. But I will acknowledge that there are historical wargamers who they are operating from that kind of the margins, and they're the niche individuals who all they see is that surface level, and maybe that's why they're interested in it. But they are by far the minority.
I would agree with that. I think that, I mean, there's just to try to even put it in a sentence when you have these complex conflicts, it could not do its justice. It just couldn't, and it would be hard for us. I think, we could spend a whole podcast on the Crusades and the what the ultimate goal was, how people in power, played on the lower populace in order to get what they wanted. Right? We've got obviously, people traveled to Jerusalem in order to conquer it to try to free their soul, right? And then there's a lot of more depth to it than that of what was actually going on. I think one of the interesting things too for this is looking at both sides and looking at both sides, not just how we feel about the conflicts that we pass, but I think looking into the sides on the conflicts. You have one of the ultimate leaders during the time with Saladin, and all of the, his efficiency as a general, his ability to bring these nations to their knees, as well as, some of the more, I think lesser known ones, and especially, don't watch Kingdom of Heaven and believe it's, just the whole period, right? There's years and decades of struggles that go on there, and how they led to it and why they had. And so, this kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier, and how these conflicts with individuals continue to perpetuate new conflicts into the modern day is just, it's extremely interesting, the depth and the level of things that happen. And it's not just, it's the butterfly effect of wings flapping and these ripples that go out in history through armies, through generals, through individual kingdoms' goals, and what's going on. To tie them all in a nice little bow and say, I'm not going to game that because of these few reasons. Like, I think to some degree, people who are staunch in historical wargaming see that, they're very upset by that because they just see the opposing force putting their head in the sand about this struggle happened. Do I know more about these Muslim empires than you did just because I've researched it? I want to see the conflict. It is extremely interesting. And then on the opposing view, people say, well, that's just a war of religion. Like, why would I even want to get involved in that? That seems so like taboo and grotesque. And, it goes back to this old adage that most historical wargamers have, which is, history repeats itself. And there's things that we can see in modern times in these conflicts, whether they be power struggles, religion, different ideologies used in conquest, that I think echo. And I think for an individual to say, hey, I'm not gonna even evolve in that, and to try to research or look into that, kind of really does a disservice to what we have in human history and why it's interesting as well as important to know where these lines are drawn in the sand for nations, and why they were, and what were the impacts on those people, for how we develop today. I think that's a good kind of jumping point to go to the next one, which, our guiding light in this discussion is proximity. And when we get into black powder, I think we have talked about this before. I think Napoleonics is kind of the OG wargaming, the original gangster for wargaming and for historical wargaming. Most people who grew up with, whether it be Kriegspilling or whatever, have kind of gone into those 1800s and get, hey, this is the development of black powder. I haven't really known a lot of people that really shy away from those conflicts because Europe is in flames at the entire time. I haven't really known, especially the wars in Europe, to be something that gives people that heartache. I do think that when I've ventured into black powder, I do see people, when you talk about colonial England, conquering the world and doing everything they did, where you do Sepoy Revolt, you talk about in Africa, you talk about even, going into the next century with, the Boxer Rebellion and those things, like they're just like, hey man, that's total colonial land grab. That's I don't want to game that. That's the subjugation of other people. And when somebody says that to me, I kind of am a little bit taken back. Not to say that I don't respect that view, and again, to each individual line their own. But I do think there is something very important about, again, a lot of literature, a lot of great, I think, innovation, as well as countries and boundaries are drawn during that time. And we have to you have to take somewhat of a respect for that. And if you don't know the period, you look at Islam Wanda for a reason. You're talking about Chelmsford's whole column wiped out by Zulus with spears and shields. The amount of people that it took to destroy a whole British column with that amount of firepower, just like this is the struggle of, in my mind, the human condition, and whether it's from what other flag or ideology it stems from in the colonialism, those are immensely interesting stories, and the depths of which they go and the people that fought them are beyond what I think in my realm. You crack open that book, that mystery novel or whatever else, and you crack open in that work of fiction, and you're like, oh, this is it's death, it's a spy, it's whatever else. These people really existed. These lives actually fell to move forward whatever ideology or conquest they want to. There is some reverence and respect I think you have to have for that period. One that is extremely taboo in Black Powder, or is verging on that, is, I think, the Civil War. I think
Clarify,
any person that is
the
in
American
America,
Civil War.
That games that. Go ahead. Did you have something? Right there,
just to clarify, the American Civil War. A lot of people had civil wars.
The American, yeah, that's right. There's only one. The American Civil War. And what happened in that conflict. I have heard people say, I don't want to game that conflict because of, obviously the tensions that surround that period with slavery, states' rights, all of those things that kind of percolate to the surface of it. But again, that is a huge part of the United States history and what happened. Now, again, this podcast is not getting into where we feel about Confederate monuments, where we feel about the nature of things that stemmed from that conflict. But I think it's powerful to bring it to the forefront of that discussion. And I think, obviously, all of these periods you can't study in a vacuum. So how did the Civil War occur? What broke down to where, somebody is beating another individual in what we consider, the most prestigious, in Congress, in federal Congress, that the lines of communication break down so much, and then, lo and behold, we march to war. States from the South march to war against states from the North, and we have that struggle of what happened. A lot of the people in the United States, obviously, and especially on the Eastern Coast, that was a conflict where it's, again, a famous rule set too, brother versus brother, that affects all of our lives. I don't think by wargaming that conflict, I'm glorifying the atrocities that occurred, or maybe what we see as the atrocious reasons for fighting and for leading 600,000 people to their death. But I think it's extremely critical to know where you've come from as just a human being on this earth, and if you're an American citizen, on why this developed, why this happened, who were the players involved, and what led to these battles, and again, ultimately to the preservation of the Union. When you are able to wargame that on the tabletop, I think you have a much more respect for, oh, this is why President Lincoln keeps relieving these commanders. This is why we have to win this war. We have to have these things that happened. And kind of taking at least a 30,000-foot view of it, that makes that conflict that, anybody in the Eastern Coast that, has been here for a while, or have family linked back to these states, can probably tie their lineage to those. So that, to me, is extremely important. And I don't look at it on, if I, obviously I have both sides painted. I'm not painting these rebels to subjugate, what I feel, or to promulgate slavery. And I'm not painting these Union for the sense of, for whatever reason, that you want to have a negative view on it. But it's tied into my family's history. It's tied into the history of this, great nation. And it's definitely a formidable part of it. And I think it's super important. And even kind of backtracking a little bit, and I'd like to turn it over to you on your thoughts on black powder. But we talked a little bit. I talked with a friend before we started this episode about, the French and Indian War, a period that me and you, I think, Wyndehust both love. And again, the atrocities that occurred to the Native Americans, the cutthroat nature, I think, of both the French and the British during this period as they tried to carve up, this part of the New World Empire that they had. Is extremely important to how our nation was formed, is extremely important to what was going on in the world that led, it would eventually lead to the American War of Independence. But I think those are pivotal roles. But as you get closer, I think, in and deep into black powder, there are things where, whether you want to say bad guys or good guys, but there are things where ideologies, people, hey man, if I paint that type of an army, or if I paint a British force in the French and Indian War where they're just raping and pillaging, it's a lot more complex in my mind than that. And although slavery is a huge component of the Civil War, I think you can't say it's not, but they're very complex ideologies. And I think when the individual takes over historical wargaming, gets steeped in that knowledge, it's extremely, powerful to reflect on where we've come, where we're going, and how we can avoid, possibly these conflicts in the future. But what are your thoughts, kind of, too, with looking at controversial conflicts and in the lens of black powder?
So again, I think it plays into proximity. I think the biggest problem and why you get controversy in historical wargaming is local politics, and what is from your nations and from your shared history, what is considered a controversial topic in your society. And the reason I specify that is because I would say that, yes, wargaming the Civil War is controversial in the United States. It is not a controversial period to wargame in the rest of the world. It is actually quite a popular period to play throughout Europe, because a lot of wargamers, we acknowledge the history and the politics that went into the creation of why this conflict happened. But when you go in to game it, you're not thinking about the why, the politics behind why this nation necessarily is fighting this other one. You're looking at the situation the commanders find themselves in. And it might be, okay, well, you want to play the Confederates because it interests you tactically to play the faction, the side that is undersupplied, is kind of the underdog. Or maybe because I think when you compare it, if you let's step back then from the American Civil War and look at the English Civil War, kind of right on the cusp of black powder, or even the Zulu Wars, or even the Napoleon Wars. A lot of the British wargamers here that I met with, a lot of them like to collect and might only collect Zulus. A lot of them have French armies for Napoleonics, or maybe only French armies. That's the faction they like to play the most. Or a lot of them wargame the English Civil War. And I think because they're not going into it thinking about the politics of why this or that side, they're looking tactically at the commanders and what makes for interesting wargaming. And those conflicts aren't being politicized right now. And so I want to make that distinction, because I think it's important for, if you're looking at historical wargaming, you think, oh, well, I don't want to play this or that period. The line in the sand for you should be, what are you comfortable with playing? And I'll acknowledge, as an American, I was very hesitant to start collecting American Civil War, even though my family history was very much involved in the conflict, because I know some people might feel uncomfortable if they're like, well, I don't want to play the Confederates because I'm afraid people might then perceive that I support the politics behind that faction side. And I acknowledge that in America, that that idea that perception is reality. And I challenge people, to step back and think, okay, if they're playing this faction that historically was the bad guy, in their mindset, understand that as historical wargamers, we're going into this because it's a game. You very rarely get individuals who are fascinated with history or an idolatry, or they're on the extremes, who then like to express that through wargaming. That's not really the demographic we're made up with. It's people who have fun gaming, and then they look at, okay, well, what makes a fun game? What sides are fun to play, and why? Do I want to play the Zulu because I don't have guns, and I have in mass formations with spear and shield have to overwhelm these technologically but numerically superior but numerically inferior force? Or is it more fun to play the British, who are technically or technologically superior, but there's so few of them? There's the challenge. That's why people go into those.
And I think that fun, goes to the game. I think that if you're a historical wargamer, by the very nature, historical being before wargaming, I think there is this reverence and respect you have for the period. The period is interesting to you. The players are interesting to you. The armies are interesting to you. And then I think when you talk about the actual game itself, I think that's what, you want to create either a battle or not create. You want to go back to these historical battles and say, wow, this is, me and you talked about this, a little bit of a pitch back to ancients, but, the Norman conquest of England has so much to do about the language and the infusion. I remember taking a linguistics class about, how the French language continued to basically and seep into the English language. And all of these things have the impact. So I think the historical side of people is, definitely want to cut against. These are games at the end of the day. They are historical wargaming, but there is this, it's a dual kind of parallel road that we're on, where it's, you have the game side of it and you're wanting to play games that are challenging. They show the period, maybe they reflect the friction of the period and what's going on, whether it be shields and spears versus rifles, or whether it be the tactics that the army used to overwhelm the other army, be it maybe thinking outside the box, as well as the miniatures are reflecting now the leaders, the armies, and the units that were involved, and how, you can go on any YouTube channel and look back at these reverend units and armies in the period. I think those two are interlinked. I think that sometimes they go, like, we have to make concessions, I think, on both sides, right, to play what most historical wargamers would consider a 2 to 3 hour game. Well, we can't get all of the units right on the table to make this war game play out in that amount of time, but we can at least give the players the friction and what was the feel, what were the tactics being used. And I see that as just kind of being in line with what you're addressing there, as that equals the game, that puts the player in that situation. Would you say that's a fair assessment? I think the history is always in the background.
Yeah, I would agree.
It has to be.
I think the misconception is that, from people who aren't historical wargamers, from the outside looking in, the misconception they have is that because I have painted and modeled and then played this nation on a war game or this faction, that somehow equates to I agree with their political stances. And that's that's just a straight
major misconception.
Yeah, and that's just a straight fallacy 99.999% of the time. I will acknowledge that in all walks of life, you will get bad apples or bad seeds. So I'm not going to say that they don't exist. That would be a lie. But it is well and by far the minority. And with that, if you're thinking, well, I don't want to play this game because I don't want to be the bad guy, that doesn't mean you agree with them. You can play the Germans, you can play the Confederate, you can play whatever the faction might be that is considered the bad guy, or in your mind is the bad guy, and acknowledge that doesn't mean you agree with them You're at the end of the day, it's a game. It's a historical war game, but it's also just a game. And picking the side you play on in no way means that you agree with the stance. I do think as historical wargamers that, like you said, the history is important to us and we acknowledge what led to the conflict and probably are much better informed than people who aren't historical wargamers. But please don't look at us and think that means automatically we agree with what they do, with historically what they stood for, and or what they're being politicized now. And I think that is like the whole. We could sum up this whole section of controversy with that misconception.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a good transition too, because proximity is the theme of this, and so we
Yes.
went all the way from the dawn of man to we're into black powder. You know, ancients and medieval, they have their threads in there, and I think a lot of people, you know, kind of reconcile those with the distance in time. And black powder is more formidable, you know, for the history of the United States, the history of the colonial empires, and what happened. And there's some things that we have that are easily played and sometimes that are not. And so looking into modern and, you know, the 20th century and kind of beyond, we're focusing now on like World War One, going all the way through World War Two, Korean War, and then, you know, again, obviously the war on terror, Vietnam War, all of those things that are wrapped in there to modern day what we see as Ukraine. When I've talked to several friends, and again, I find there's a solid group of veterans in most historical wargaming periods, and I know these historical wargamers, to me, when we've had discussions, are, man, I love playing World War II. It's great. You know, no matter whether we're playing, here's what I'm trying to get out of it. This is a company rule set, or this is a, you know, it's supposed to replicate a company or a battalion or a mixed force, or even the, you know, cinematic kind of skirmish World War II games. And they'll play that all day long. And these are people that have served 20 plus years. But when it comes to modern conflict, again, you know, this is somebody who's steeped in the history, but they'll say, hey, I won't play it because, you know, I was deployed for, you know, of my 20-year career, I was in Iraq or Afghanistan for 5 or 6 years of my life. And it's too real for me. It's too, that is too close to the proximity. You know, both me and you had talked about it even before this podcast. We have lost friends in the war on terror. And I think that, you know, that I think in alone shows that proximity has something to do with playing the game and where the lines are drawn. I myself, you know, in my modern collection, a lot of my modern collection is based for early invasion of Iraq and some of those things. They haven't played it in a long, long time. But to me, you know, personalize this and internalizing this, I have the miniatures for you know, the recent more recent years in Afghanistan and what would be considered, you know, the war on terror, wherever it may be. I really haven't painted them, haven't been led to paint them, but it's something for me on the tabletop that, you know, I don't feel it is calling to me right now. But I do. There are some points in my, you know, my life where I don't know if I necessarily have an aversion for it either. But I think, you know, I think that's a probably a good way to pick that up is, you know, that conflict and the proximity are definitely certain. And so somebody who can play, you know, what their grandfathers fought in and still, you know, even if they think their grandfather is one of the miniatures on the table or how they've painted his unit or whatever the case may be, but yet there still is to some degree the veterans who have recently served, there is somewhat of a line in the sand that they won't play. What are your feelings on that with modern conflicts?
Yeah, so I do have quite a large, well, I had a large collection of painted modern, like ultra modern stuff, you know, right up until the present day, including Ukraine. But most of that got stolen a couple years back. But I am rebuilding that collection. I think when it comes to like the last 100 years, it's when you need to start, like, you just need to be aware. This is where I'm more comfortable with people drawing lines in the sand, and I think it's important to be respectful because, like, my uncle by marriage is first generation American. His father served in the German army, and I got to meet him a couple times and listen to fascinating stories about, from his side, his perspective, from, kind of the other side. I've got a very close family friend, one of my dad's good friends, who served in the thick of it in Vietnam. And I once showed him a picture of some, he was in riverboats and stuff during Vietnam, and I showed him a collection that somebody had done, and it was a bit of a trigger for him and his PTSD. And, that's something to be aware of. And like, if he was a wargamer and he's like, yeah, I wouldn't be comfortable wargaming that, I'm not going to scoff at that. Like I wouldn't scoff at anybody who has a personal reason for any period in history. Like that's like we talked about, lines in the sand. That's their personal lines in the sand. And I think most historical wargamers would be respectful of that. The same going back, to the Crusades. If for you, there's a personal reason that you want to draw a line in the sand, I don't think anyone's going to kick sand at you. But I have lost friends in the more recent modern conflicts. I don't think it's disrespectful towards them, wargaming them. I think for me, one of the reasons I'm really drawn to wargaming modern conflicts is because a lot of the times I'm gaming with people who have no real connection. Like they might be a veteran, but they not from our war, like yours and my conflict. And so, a lot of them might not be veterans of anything. And so I feel like it's a way to get them to understand and see what like we have gone through and what that conflict looks like, because it's so much a part. I mean, pretty much my whole living memory growing up, we were in the Middle East in conflicts, and to the point that then I was, deployed, and I know you've deployed. And so, I think getting people to wargame that, I'm doing it with the utmost respect, and I think it's important for people to see what those conflicts look like. And I don't think there's any issue with somebody playing the insurgents, and we'll cover some of this in the next topic. I don't think they should feel bad playing the insurgents, because ultimately it's a war game, and I think it's important. I'm happy to play the insurgents because I think, I'm still in the military. I think it's important and beneficial for me to try and think like they think tactically. Okay, what are the tactical decisions?
Sun Tzu it a little bit.
Yeah, like and I think that's true from all periods. And that's where it comes in. What is tactically stimulating? The decisions made. There's a set of rules for modern conflicts, and I'm not going to throw their name out there, but they do really well kind of representing that both sides have different objectives, and they might not be directly opposing. You could just end up be that you guys get in each other's way, but acknowledging that why people are fighting, and then how does that translate onto the battlefield and the tactical decisions you have to make, makes for a stimulating game. And so, in this kind of idea of, the controversial conflicts, I mean, if you're doing it respectfully and you're not glorifying either side, I wouldn't try to glorify, Americans, going through, places in Iraq and Afghanistan any more than I would glorify the other side, regardless of what side I'm on, because, like we said in the beginning, the sanctity of life, people are dying regardless of what side they're on, or if I personally believe they're the bad guy, they're still human beings in real life, and therefore deserving of my respect. And so to me, I translate that onto the tabletop, that they're human beings we're representing, and still deserving of respect in that sanctity of life. So I think if you're keeping that in mind.
I think it's important here to note too. We did a little bit of a net call with a few of the gaming groups that we gamed with, and I think that's an interesting way to kind of look into the modern about. You are putting it out there on the table. You're doing it from respect. You've actually lived through it. We've, again, like you said, lost friends in this conflict, and there's no you're trying to do it in a respectful manner, but yet showing you are steeped in the knowledge, right, of that period. And so whether you do Fallujah and you research all about that operation and everything, you are learning on why that. Again, I think history, for most historical wargamers, you can't study it in a vacuum. You have to know why are we here, what are the consequences, and what's going on, and what's at stake for both sides. Like, what is the overall goals? And I think that just makes the person, kind of read into that more. I still look at these, we continue to talk about this line that everyone has, and I think our view, probably, as well as a prevailing view, is of most people, is if that line's not for you, then don't take it. But I do want to echo here a sentiment from one of the outlying people, Mark. One of my friends, Mark, who plays bolt action with me a lot, he recently was gifted a Waffen SS army, and the entire army. I'm talking well over, probably $100 of models, and it was because a spouse and a gamer, in a various state, had family that were tied to that conflict, and obviously on the opposite side. And not to say, not to tell their whole story, but that it was tied to kind of the way it made the spouse feel about the gaming. And so the wargamer had to give that army up to a local person here, Mark. And there are things that are going to affect where people's lines are that are going to be extremely personal. And so the other day I talked to a friend who I think is glib on some of the earlier thing, is like, and when we started the conversation on the phone, because he had a lot to say about historical wargaming, he was I think what we see as our maybe on the far spectrum of, if you can't talk about taking life and stuff and something that's human, well then you're a wuss, or you're as weak as it can be. And then when I continued, me and that friend continued the discussion, he will not game modern. And he will not game modern because he's been in several firefights, as a lower enlisted in the War on Terror. He has lost friends. He has done, a lot of the things that you can do. And it was interesting as we continued the conversation to see, like, how we view other people's lines, but then how we internalize our own line. And, well, you can't make fun of me because of, these things, but, felt confident, maybe not making fun of, but kind of saying how there's this like double standard to viewing that. And I think it goes back to, again, there's every hobby, every part has a few bad apples in it. I don't think they're prevailing. I don't think most historical wargamers are warmongers or alt-rightists or alt-leftists, obviously, or something along that range. But I think that I think a majority of historical wargamers come from it with a view of respect, reverence, the period, the people, the units, the interesting part of it, and that's what kind of prevails in their game. And just to kind of point back to those lines, like, those lines exist, they're out there, they're very personal to the individual, and I think there's ways that we can navigate those lines. It's the same thing of taking a veteran to go see Saving Private Ryan, right? There's stories where veterans can't sit through it, or they don't like war movies, or the case may be, and people don't like those things. I think it's important to note here, and I think our theme that both me and you are getting at is those lines are very wide, through the spectrum of historical wargamers, and they're very personal to the individual. And as long as you can keep that in the lens of when you're gaming the conflict and what's going on, I think that, that will be the prevailing thing. There's ways that we can come to the tabletop, game this period, be passionate about it, be historically minded about it, and be respectful of it, that shouldn't be controversial to some degree. But I understand that controversy exists based on that personal held view. And I would just, ask both sides to be very willing to kind of examine, why they hold that view, with what, veracity they hold that view. Are we just cutting the discussion off at the knees, and we're not going to talk about gaming any of these conflicts because of XYZ? I think that might miss the mark, because I think there's these controversial conflicts are tied to our human history, They're definitely important to understand at bottom. But then I think that we need to be respectful of those individuals, at least to some degree, in the sense of here's how we can show what we're trying to show on the tabletop, whether it be the history, the people, the units, the leaders, and the decisions, like you said, the tactical decisions that they're making. Before, I know that we've talked a lot about these controversial conflicts, and we've gone back and forth. What other thoughts, do you want to at least chime in there with, or do you feel like there's anything that we've missed?
No, I think the big one, kind of summing it up for me, it's a lot of this kind of controversy comes from kind of ignorance, and then this misconception that because you play a side in a war game, that means you agree with their political stance at that time in history, which I think is a pretty arduous fallacy. But like we talked about the lines in the sands, like I think most wargamers, historical wargamers, are pretty respectful, and so I think the approach should be, if you're on the outside looking in, the approach should be, I'm not comfortable with this period or this conflict because of whatever your personal reason is. You're not required to share it, so you don't have to play it. But that doesn't mean you should look down on those who do. Acknowledge that you don't want to do it, and that's fine. We will respect you for that. I think any historical wargamer would respect your decision. But please don't think that because others do decide to play it, that they agree with whatever it is you have issue with. So, like, I think that's a good way to put it.
I think that anybody that plays World War II, and has a German army probably isn't a flag-carrying Nazi. And anybody that is gaming colonial empires or not, they don't feel that view on it. I think that's a great point. And I'll let you. I think getting back into our next topic on the controversy in wargaming and historical wargaming, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. So we're going to kind of talk about depraved acts and controversial symbology in games. And by that, so I think the controversial symbology is pretty obvious what that means, but let me kind of define what we mean by depraved acts. So at the kind of bottom end, we're talking about, the Viking Raiders, the objective of the game or something, the Viking Raiders, trying to capture civilians and cart them off. That's, part of the game. Or does a game like in the Muskets and Tomahawks include scalping as a mechanic? Or head taking in feudal Japan, which was a big part of that warfare, and how the controversy of those being in the games and represented as an action, and does it have a place, doesn't have a place, kind of how we feel about that and how we've seen it done. So it's kind of a two-part thing. It's like it's the acts you do in the game, and then the other part of it is the symbology. Whether that's the things you actually model, like are you modeling those acts? Are you, or the symbology of the flags that are being used, or the uniforms and things like that. So is there one of those you'd like to start off with, Kentuckian, or do you kind of have a thought of both together?
I think we can end with symbology. I think a lot of people talk about symbology. I think depraved acts, in my mind, doing warfare is never black and white, and in the desperate struggle often goes headfirst into the brutal and gruesome. And we've talked about this, and you are, whether you're using a sword in your Bronze Age or you're using a rifle and pointing it at somebody, you're trying to take their life. But what is kind of even over that? What is scalping was a huge one that we talked about in Muskets and Tomahawks, carrying off civilians in that Viking game. There was a game I played at Historicon several years ago where you're a Viking raiding a town or a hamlet on one of the coasts, and as it's a raiding party. You don't have a lot of people, but you're trying to get as much loot and people as you can. and that is the purpose. Now, what does the Viking do with the woman as he carts her off? He probably doesn't have a picnic with her, but I think one of the big things is kind of killing civilians in a game or carrying off civilians and those things, on how they affect not only going into war crimes and that stuff, but what does that look like on the tabletop? To me, I think this is a majority of the historical wargamers I sent out this message to, and at least was getting feedback from. There's parts of the period that they're definitely tied to it. And I think for scalping, there was the idea that you had to get scalps. In some of the French and Indian games I've played, whether it was a token or things like that. And that's tied to, again, the history of the period and what those tribes did to some degree, but it's stuff that you can't study in a box by itself. I think a lot of people didn't have issue that when I talked with them, but then when we talked about something in more Vietnam or recent conflict on cutting ears off, right, by obviously Vietnam units who are going in there, or what it was. You can even go back to the Bible and Saul and David, right? He made him cut off members of the Philistines in order to bring them back to prove that they had killed them. So there's graphic, and brutal and gruesome things that happen in warfare, and especially when you talk about how does that equate to the tabletop. I think one of the biggest trends that I saw in these acts was, does this make the game any more steeped in the period, or is it just too much? Is it a bridge too far? And is it way too beyond the scope of what it happens? And I mean, the idea is there is definitely a fine line when you talk into brutal warfare about this stuff, but a lot of people like horror movies, right? And so if it's just a slasher film where there's too many deaths, or they're too, how does this person die in this much? It's just you're going over the top. And so there's, in my personal held belief, I think that the French and Indian rule sets that I've seen where scalping is part of it, obviously you're not, the miniatures aren't really doing it. I've got Native American miniatures that are holding up knives or scalps or something of that nature. But I to me, that seems more palpable than more modern conflicts where that's happening. And then I think a thing where all of the historical wargamers I've talked to, like the killing of unarmed civilians in the game, is definitely maybe a bridge too far, I think, for what you're trying to equate to the tabletop. So me and you and a few other people that I've played with Muskets and Tomahawks recently played the raid on the town, or the massacre scenario. And the idea is that there's upwards of 10 plus people in this town that, whether you're French or British, you're trying to protect from the opposing side, which is French or British, and you're trying to keep those people safe. The people have lesser armed equipment, lesser armed weapons, and that's kind of it. And when I was discussing this with a friend, he said, well, are the people women and children, or are they people like just your farmers? What are they? Because that would definitely influence, if they'd even see that as a line to be played. In the rule set, obviously the people are armed, and I think I had one or two female models that had rifles that were armed with the people when we played the scenario. It really didn't equate for their families, who you would assume would be at this farm and on this whatever it is, hamlet or whatever the case may be. And I think that to me, there's no issue with that. I'm not. Obviously, those people have picked up arms, so the idea is they're probably falling into this militia category. If they're living on the frontier, they understand that, if you try to peel back some of those layers, and their families are not equated in the rule set, whether they're there in the cabin right next to them, or whether they're, they long took off in the night before they knew the raid was coming, was their, again, significant other, or whoever was to stay to defend the hamlet. I don't have an issue with that. Of a scenario where you're immediately killing civilians or something, I think, what am I trying to get out of the game? There's a level in Call of Duty that became very popular and what I believe was taken out of the game, right? They don't speak Russian or whatever it is, where they went into an airport and they killed as many civilians as they could, and it was a first-person shooter game, and that game got a lot of blowback from it. But I mean, it was stuck in the game for a long time, and you were walking around an airport, killing people as they ran away. I mean, there's something to where when you get next to those depraved acts and you get numb to it, I think it is a little much. But there's parts of, warfare, and especially tabletop warfare gaming, that I think you can replicate that without replicating it to the absurd or to highlighting the depraved acts, but yet you're still keeping, the period and how the fighting happened. I think you're going after it from that angle. What are your thoughts on that, Wyndehust?
Yeah, so I would sum it. I would say first that specifically skirmish and small scale conflicts. So we're not talking about big, huge rank and file, big armies, line battles. Skirmish style conflicts, very rarely the objective was to kill the other soldiers. Like, I'm going to go here, fight the other soldiers, and wipe the field of them. That was not often the objective of that small scale fighting. Usually it was something else. Is it supplies? Is it intel? What might it be? So when I look at, does the depraved acts, quote unquote, belong in the war game, then my consideration is, does it force a tactical decision on that player? So here's some examples. Let's say the scalping. If you look at the history, it was very often, there was a lot of conflict between the European nations and their Native American allies on what their objectives were, right? So the French didn't want the British to get control. But a lot of time their Native American allies were out for either because this land used to be theirs, or they were out for loot and prizes that would make them more wealthy. And one of those things was scalp taking, because they were incentivized to take scalps. So should it belong in my game? If there's a mechanic that rewards the Native American player with more victory points for the scalps they have, then I say, yes, it belongs. Because now that player has to decide, okay, do I go for the scalps? Do I stop and take the time to gather them? Or do I continue battering down the enemy? Do I have a European ally I'm supposed to support? Okay, well, is it really in my best interest, victory-wise, to support them, or to go after this other, tactical objective? It's forcing tactical decisions based off historical context. And so in that case, I'd say, yes, it belongs. In the ear-taking example for Vietnam, I can't think of a way where there was some tactical advantage or some way you could put that in where there's more victory, like even from historical context. So I would say no, there's no reason to include that in the game, because there's nothing you could tie it to historically why it would force a tactical decision this way or that way. The same with the Vikings carting off civilians. I mean, I played a game like that with my kids. I was the Saxons, they were playing Vikings, and their objective was to search the houses for and they would roll, and they would either find valuables to take or prisoners to take. And my objective as the Saxons was protecting the wealth, both physical and of lives. So it wasn't in the Viking player's best interest just to go up and get stuck in a fight, because that's not how they were going to get victory. That's how I was going to get victory as a Saxon player. And it actually led to some very interesting things in the game where I ended up knocking out one of their leaders, one of my son's characters as a Viking leader, but they had made off with a couple of civilian hostages. So then we did this little at the end of the game where I was like, okay, well, your leader's still alive, but I captured him because he was wounded, because I bested him in single combat. I will trade you back your Viking leader if you give me back my civilian hostages. And so, it led to some tactical decisions and some very interesting gameplay. So I think in that case, including it as a mechanic added to the experience of the game and to the context of the historical setting that we are playing.
No, and that's is like the civilian game that I played. Like, again, the Vikings are probably, not going to treat those prisoners well, and whatever what place do those acts have on the table? And I think, it's tied into what are the tactical advantage, how historical is it, and does it add anything to, at the end of the day, again, the parallel of the history and the war game. There is a war game going on at this time, so we have to. How much time do we have to get that game? Does it add that tactic? Does it show, what was going on in the period and what the idea is? And I think there's parts to that. I've never played a game where I've done some grotesque or brutal act in the game. I think that is a line in the sand, whether it be said out loud or if it hasn't been, where, that's being done. I do think that a line that I often see, and I've heard back from other historical wargamers, is the outright killing of civilians. There are games where you protect civilians or you protect some type of militia, and the outright killing, what would that look like? And what kind of game is that? I think that would be where it's, to the equivalent of the phrase of shooting fish in a barrel. Like, what are you getting out of that? And there's ways and pressure, like in the Viking game that I was talking about that I'd played. It was a homebrewed rule set, and so as you're the Vikings that are raiding the coast, you're coming in there. People are mobilizing, and again, the first house you get to, obviously, the person with the sword and spear is probably not going to hold up to you. And what would we classify him as, a civilian or not? But that added a level to the game of, there are some buffers that the local populace had against the Vikings, whether their first few people were taking up arms against them, trying to rally, trying to go and join the militia before they came in to make that a bigger force. And that really kind of magnified the game to a sense where it wasn't, we're not living in the depravity and the horrible, gruesome, and brutal things that are happening to those people, but we are, there is some truth in the sense of that person and that player had decisions to make on, do those people, unfortunately, were their lives to become speed bumps, to help give the militia more time to get there and kick out the Vikings, or, did they serve that purpose? So anything that I think puts friction there, to add to the layer of the war game and to add to the layer of the history that happened during the period, I think that there's value in that. But to have blood and gore and, whatever the case may be in the depraved act for its very nature alone, normally if it's not adding into it or it's pushing the envelope on, that's not even necessary. That's kind of where my line is, I would say, personally, and from what I've heard of a lot of the historical wargamers we talked to, I think it's pretty similar. And from what you've said, I think that's similar as well. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, again, if I haven't seen in any rule sets that I have in any, let me rephrase that. I haven't seen any historical rule sets that there are what you might consider depraved acts for no good reason other than just to have them. If they have a tactical reason for being there, then I'm fine with them being there. And I'll go so far as to say, when I put on or try and organize a modern game set in the Middle East, I find in most cases it's very important to have unarmed civilians because of it was such a key challenge in that conflict, in that one side cares very much about making sure they don't accidentally kill civilians. And tactically speaking, the other side, it was very beneficial for them if that happened. And so, if you're talking about having civilians on the table and you're playing an insurgent player and you have even somebody disguised as a civilian with a suicide vest, I think it's okay, again, like we said, with the respect for the sanctity of life, but having those on the table because they represent historically accurate settings and they force real tactical decisions that players have to make, that makes you stop and think, geez, like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to approach this situation? How is this going to work? How does this play in towards my end goal of victory? What does victory look like with these factors on the table? And so I think if it's in that context, it's fine for me. And I'm perfectly okay though with someone saying like I'm not comfortable with that. I think that's fine. You know, if like you said, a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to kill civilians. Well, I personally am fine with a group of civilians being the target for one side, and the other side's objective is keeping them alive. But that assumes then that they have tactical options to do that. If you're just saying like, well, all I have is civilians, and you're coming at me with a whole bunch of Viking raiders, well, there's no real tactical decisions for me to make as the civilian player, right? I'm just running around seeing how long before you either capture or kill me. That's not a game. There's no tactics to that. But if you're saying like I have a group of peasant farmers armed with, you know, tools and spears and stuff, and my objective is to keep my unarmed civilians alive as long as possible until the local lord shows up, you know, the cavalry arrives, then to me there's tactical decisions to make there. There's a game. So okay, that's fine. And I think that's where my line is. If there's a good tactical reason for it to be there that you can also tie historically to it being relevant, then I'm fine with it. But like we said earlier, I respect everyone's decision and their line in the sand. So if you're not okay with it,
that's an awesome point that you said. You know, it gives you the friction of the period and the commander, and you putting yourself in that role. And, you know, being true to that, but understanding that people, you know, if we are playing a conflict, there is this idea. I've had other players say, well, it's all make-believe. You know, there's no different in playing 40K and what you're playing because you're putting it in the make-believe and the separation that you have. So I have heard people, you know, there's a lot of ways to, I think, get to. It's getting you steeped in the period. It's putting you in the decision-making process of whether it's the small unit leader or the commander on this, and civilians on the battlefield throughout history are on there. So how can you do that in a way that is not as the shooting fish in the barrel and just kind of highlighting war crimes, but how is it a way that's putting it in there that it really happened or did happen or, you know, would have happened in that sense, and putting it in that friction of the decision. There's one thing that you mentioned. I think it'll be a good way to tie us up on the depraved acts of what we see on the table and people that, you know, whether you find it taboo or not. And it's the idea of, you know, the suicide bomber, or the idea of extending this person's one goal is to maximize casualties to the other side, and in that goal, it's going to be their own death. So another rule set that's coming to mind, obviously, is bolt action. With you have the punji mine, right, from the Japanese, where the rule set, I believe, specifically says it runs up to the enemy vehicle. If it rolls to hit, it hits, and the vehicle takes this amount of blast damage with this penetration, and the mine stick Japanese soldier is removed, right? So there's countless rule sets where you have an individual who is giving their life to take the enemy life. And there's some people that I know that have even looked at that as, hey, that's taboo. Going back to your sense, that was a tactic of several armies throughout history, and whether you put it in the modern context of suicide bombing or not, I think, you know, turning the mirror back on to the listener, if they were somebody who initially found that as taboo, it's in my mind, it's almost semantics to say whether you're in a World War I trench and the whistle blows and you're going to be the first out of the trench to go forward, you know, maybe you know you're going towards your impending death, or whether you're on the Napoleonic frontier and you're going, out and you're doing a desperate charge, or in any, period of history, that is, in my mind, synonymous with, things that soldiers and initial, whatever you want to say, soldier, warrior, or service member to whatever nation or army you're playing with, that's stuff that actually happened, they actually did, and came to be a viable tactic, as you can tell from, countless stories of what happened. And there's some people that I do know say that pushes the envelope too far. But again, like I think you said, all of those times that I can see it in a rule set, it gives you that look into history, that look into that period, that look into what the enemy is using that for, how they're getting that, their combat power through that entity, through that individual who is laying down their life, on whatever altar of ideology, conquest, or no matter what, fighting for. And so, to me, that's very in tied with what every soldier has going through their mind, whether they have a rifle in their hand or a box that they're trying to throw at a tank and get close enough. What they deal with in that friction. Before we move on, do you have any last minute thoughts about kind of what I just inputted in there with the maybe not the suicide bomber himself, but soldiers who, based on the war game mechanics, they are giving up that inch, by
I think
for lack of a better word, by killing themselves.
I think it comes into the sanctity of life, because if you're on the outside looking in, you put yourself in the commander of that player who's putting themselves in the commander's position. Here I have a soldier who he's going to do what I tell him to do in this war game, and very often in history that's how it went. And whatever he's going to attack, like in that situation, like suicide forces, they're one shot, they're gone. I have to spend it wisely. I have to be cautious with it and not waste it. And likewise, when you're on the opposite side facing something like that, you're thinking like, man, how do I keep my guys alive? How do I contend with this, this force that could be disguised or is going to come at me up close? There's a respect there, I think, for the sanctity of life of your force and how you utilize it on the tabletop that you're considering, especially when man, that's what it's there for. I'm going to use it and it's going to be gone. That person is sacrificing themselves. And I think you go into it thinking like, okay, I've got to really use it cautiously and carefully because they'll be gone after that. And so I think instinctively a lot of us historical wargamers, pay a respect from either side of the force in it. But yeah, that would be my final thought really on depraved acts.
Great point. Again, hopefully we're trying to show on the spectrum of where these lines are for individuals, where we think that we feel our lines are personally, and how we can, again, when we talk about gruesome and brutal acts on the tabletop, what is the benefit of it? And I think again we round up to the sense of, does that give you that decision-making process, that commander in that time period? And does it add to the war game at the end of the day? If it's not adding to it and it's just sadistic or some other thing, then I think both me and you, that's probably our line, and I think a vast majority of war gamers. Moving on to kind of what we wanted to talk about in our next topic this is what we look at. I think there's a lot of tension in between make-believe and historical wargaming in this sense. And so,
wait, do we
why
want to
does
talk
fantasy?
Do we want to talk about symbology?
Oh, I apologize. I went a little bit forward there.
No, we're not getting out of this one. I know it's the crux for a lot of people, but you can't get us out of it that easy.
I was trying to avoid it if I could, but yeah. So symbology and wargaming, I think, to me, I think the biggest one that I've ever seen, and the kind of the hot button topic is the swastika in World War II. I think a lot of people, will paint the aerial recognition flags, which end up being the swastika on their World War II vehicles. I think, the Confederate flag is somewhat in there with the Civil War and those things. I think there's also, there's a litany list of other symbols that you take from periods of history that are, hey, this is this unit, this is what they did, and here's the pros and cons of them. Even so much as so that when we talked about somebody who is looking from the outside in on the Crusades, and you look at the cross, I've seen a Constantine army built up, or you see that and you're like, man, this proves that your army is, religious in nature, and that's kind of what you're glorifying by doing it. I think my quick brush to that is, obviously, a lot of my World War II armies, my Germans in particular, I have aerial recognition flags on some of the vehicles. I have, which are swastika flags. That's what they actually had. That's historically accurate. Now, do a lot of my 1945 vehicles and late war tanks have aerial recognition flags on them? No, because they didn't, right? It was mid-war to early war when the Luftwaffe was still a thing that they cared about their own convoys getting strafed. Does that mean that you're, some jackboot Nazi if you've painted what is a correct symbol on your army? No, in my opinion, no, and not even close. And the Confederate battle flags that you've seen, that are in that brigade, in that unit, or on that table, to me, it's the same idea. I don't see me painting an army based off an Osprey book or my reference material historically accurate as grandizing, that army's political views or appointments, their ideologies, pushing them forward. I think it's me as a historical-minded hobbyist, me as a historical-minded person who is trying to complete this army to make it accurate. That's what I see in the symbology. But I know, that somebody who has no idea other than, maybe secondary and reference material, movies, popular culture, if they came up to a table and they saw a Panzer III with an aerial recognition flag and they were like, oh, that's your army, and then you put it on your little board to move it around, it would be, disconcerting to some. And I think that's me looking at, you have to be mindful of those things and what your purpose and what your goal is. And I can tell you, obviously, I don't have it on all my tanks, all those things. I tried to keep it to what would be historically accurate. But I do know it's something that can meander into historical wargaming and definitely be a taboo, I think, for somebody, especially who wouldn't be steeped in history. And so I think looking internally, it's me knowing that, being able to explain the reference material and those things to people and the individuals and how I'm painting this army or constructing this army, and keeping in mind in the sense that, no, that is not, me favoring this side or me doing anything else like that. My grandfather fought in World War II, obviously for the Americans, and did everything he could to, kill as many as he could for the other side. And so I think that's something that is a hot button topic. I think it's whoever takes it normally runs 90 miles an hour in the other direction and creates this line that, okay, well, we can't talk about it, or why do you have to paint Germans in that sense? Or why do you have to have the Waffen SS uniform with the SS on the lapel and the color? Hey, man, that's what they wore. That is being true to the uniform. I think if I were to erode that or degrade it in any sense, it would be not accurate, and it would kind of take away in the sense of, we're gaming this to give us the tension of the period, steep ourselves in the history of the period and those things. I'm not looking to whitewash or kind of revisionist history on the sense of this isn't what they looked like, even down to that level. And that's kind of at least my initial take on symbology. What about yourself, Wyndehust?
I have very little to add on kind of the area that you covered. I completely agree with what you're saying. I think kind of the only things I would add are, we have to be respectful that in some countries it's actually against the law to have some symbology. Like I think in Germany, it's you could not have those tanks with the swastika painted on them. That's against the law. I'm pretty sure displaying it in any case is against the law because
that's my understanding as well.
But in any other context, I think if you were to alter the historical representation, like if it belongs there historically and you were to remove it, you are giving it power. You're giving that symbol power by saying it's powerful enough, I shouldn't show it. Whereas but that's more personal speaking. But apart from those symbolisms you talked about, ones you kind of didn't hit on that we had talked about, I'd like us to mention, is other, quote unquote, the symbolism of depraved acts and, using them on the tabletop. So, throughout history, crucifying those you bested in battle, and mounting them on the edge of the battlefield was quite common historically. I when it comes to things like that, I'm not going to show, Vikings having their way with, captives and stuff, because it has no gameplay mechanic. It doesn't make sense. There's no reason to have it. There's nothing it adds to the game other than some visual randomness. If you can make an argument to me that there's a mechanic that it supports in a historical game, like maybe this is a follow-on battle, and so you've got, the Romans have crucified the Spartacus's allies, that they captured, and the idea is mechanically that having them represented on the battlefield, like, causes fear amongst the opponents within a certain radius, kind of thing. Okay, I might be able to stretch for that. But I think in our next topic, you'll find that, those depraved acts are modeled on the battlefield in such a way with mechanics that I'm much more uncomfortable with, and that you see much more common than in historical. I think it's very hard in a historical setting, I think, to show those depraved acts, the symbol, and I'm taking this into the symbology as what we're physically representing in such a way that makes sense to have it as a game mechanic wise. If it's part of like the vehicles and the uniforms, and that was the historical, and that's historically accurate, then that makes sense to me. But if then you want to show these other acts and there's, it's something else you're adding, it's not the uniforms, or it's not the banners or whatever, then I kind of draw a line in the sand there with the kind of the symbology. Or I'm much more comfortable with saying, yeah, that belong there. What do you think about those kind of things, Kentuckian?
No, yeah, we talked about, I think in the lead up to, us diving into this episode, we talked about the crucifixion, and then I know I have an Assyrian army, and so Eureka makes basically a model of, somebody who's fighting the Assyrians getting flayed or getting a pole stuck through them. And, you've got models where you can buy Vlad the Impaler, and you've got people that have been impaled, obviously a very painful way on the tabletop. There are rule sets where, the whole tactic is to scare, the opposing side. So you have my Gestade, I'm probably butchering that name. I don't speak Gaelic. But my naked Gallic warriors, there's a lot of the miniatures will have, obviously they're nude, and that is the whole idea. They're supposed to cause fear. They're protected by their gods. But they also have heads, right? Heads is a huge thing, I think, on the army. That is what that army's supposed to do. There are a lot of rule sets that give bonuses to say, when you're facing this unit of Gauls, or when you're facing this unit of Mongols, riding with, you put a human head or two on their saddle, right? That when they're riding, that is what that army wore. That is what that army looks like. You can look at it on the tabletop, and to me, it strikes fear. I just imagine myself being, an Eastern Rus or something, and Genghis Khan is coming for me, whether I'm being a Han or a Chinese person trying to protect my units or my village, my town, and or Tamerlane or whoever the case may be. You can put it in those things, that is how that army kind of struck fear. That was their purpose. And to me, those are kind of, again, where the line is like, that makes sense to me. There's a beautiful foundry sculpts where they have a German, I believe, blister bag where it has the heads on the pikes of the Romans. And there's ways that can have influence in various rule sets in the game. Just like you said, the biggest thing I've seen is a radius of kind of fear. And, then you put yourself in that Italian, legionnaire, or whoever it is, the legionnaire that's going against them, like, okay, these guys just cut off these heads. Similar to the opening scenes, right, in Gladiator, where they send the Roman ambassador across the line, he gets his head cut off, and the chieftain or whoever it is holds up his head and throws it to the opposing Roman side. Those are where I think those things can give you a sense of the game. Place. And again, say again?
They have a place in the game.
They have a place. I don't think they're just done for the mundane or to do it. And so they at least give you a sense of the army and nothing else. And then they're somehow in some different rule systems how they interact with the game. And so those are where I would see, yeah, that makes sense to me. But to just I do a Spartacus army and I paint up 50 guys crucified. What's the purpose? What's the intent? And to me, it's going a little bit above and beyond casualty figures that show, where the loss happened on the battlefield, or to show where the struggle was when people fell, to try to push that side, capture that flank, or whatever the case may be. Even disordered markers. And there's, I have disordered markers I painted up where they have an arm is cut off, or a spear has gone through somebody. And I think I've done it in at least enough of a tasteful way to where it's not just a smattering of body parts on there. But again, seeing that those lines are very personal to the individual who's playing the game. But I think definitely in some historical war games, when we talk about the grotesque kind of symbology, you got to take a look and say, what's the purpose? Does it serve that purpose? And is it, assisting in the game to some degree? So I would kind of concur with your opinions on that. Anything else that we need to tie up on symbology, or any other issues?
I pretty much bracket, the symbology of depraved acts. If it happens during the battle, then you can probably make a case for it. If it happens, if it's, or if it's historically accurate as part of their kit. So like the heads on a pike, if it's something they're carrying that's part of their kit, okay. If it's your leader model who's depicted over the body of an enemy holding the head up, that's something that you would say, okay, well, that's going to happen. That happens in the battle, and I'm just modeling it this way. But if it's something they would do with the prisoners or the dead after the battle, or then the battle's over. There's no reason to model that and put it on the table, or to require roles or mechanics for it, because the battle's done. So I think that's kind of how I bracket it. But yeah, that's my last thought on it.
Going into this next topic that I was pulled back immediately from and should have been, was, we talked about kind of the two opposing views here, and I think what gets a lot of criticism from historical wargamers are fantasy and future fantasy gamers, seem to get a pass on some of these issues. They seem to be our biggest critics. Arguably, the Chaos armies, from whether the old world or 40K and beyond, and go beyond what happened in history, and perpetuating those things on the table under the guise of its make-believe, while demonizing the reverence and respect I would say a vast majority of historical wargamers have when playing their respective period, seems to be to some degree hypocritical. So again, this isn't a huge long topic, but what are your thoughts on that when you look at the old world and 40K? And going back to these acts and symbology.
I mean, especially considering what we just talked about, I feel like it's much more common in fantasy and sci-fi settings to have these acts depicted on a much more gruesome level than even you would see historically, or even to include mechanics where you perform these acts on the table. Butchering, especially as like a chaos person, the more bodies you butcher. I did say, though, historically speaking, for depraved acts, if there is a mechanical need that forces, tactical decisions, okay, if you're going to have those worked into your rules in your fantasy and science fiction games, then fine. But like you said, they shouldn't get a pass then over historical wargaming. Yes, and I think one thing I told you when we were talking about this, like, okay, well, let's look at it this way. You're doing those acts in your fantasy games, and they're happening in my historical games. But, they're bad in the historical games. You're choosing to play the fantasy sci-fi games that have those. They don't have to, because they're make-believe. They didn't happen, so you can have them as clean as you want them to be, but you're choosing to put them in. So we're, the historical wargamer, we're representing historical things that actually happened, in a tasteful way. If anything,
we try to be tasteful about it, but I think that's that's the veil that, from what I see of the fantasy and future fantasy genre, kind of hides behind is, well, this is this never happened. This is, do you feel, I personally don't feel that has any credence, but, hiding behind the fact that it's all make-believe, and obviously there aren't orcs, or there aren't these genetically modified humans that do this, or this, whatever it is. Talk about genocide, it's on the level of worlds, and, not just countries. But they hide behind a veil, from my understanding and from what I've discussed with people, is that it's make-believe, and that makes it more palpable. Do you think that's right? Do you think that that's accurate? Do you think that that should have credence?
I agree that they're doing it, but I don't think that it makes what we do in historical wargaming somehow worse than what they're doing. So I guess there's two ways we should be looking at this. All right. So from outsiders who don't wargame at all, looking at the hobby as a whole and saying that this area, being historical wargaming, is somehow worse than that area, which is not historical wargaming. Me much more than you. I play a lot more than just historical war games, and I don't take issue on either way, because regardless of what I'm playing, I keep it in the same mindset. If they're my forces, then I have the same respect for the fighting and the lives, even if they're aliens or whatever. Even my undead monster, I don't just waste things the same way, or some way different than I might otherwise. And so I think if you're a non-wargamer looking and you think there's something wrong with the historical side, then I think you should look at yourself and see what ignorance maybe you're coming from. Maybe ignorance is too strong a word. You might have blind spots to history, whether because your only education of it might really be coming from popular culture, which is way off from how things really were. And so popular culture is telling you that this is what this means, and therefore that's, if we are playing that, then we must agree with that, or that's how we are. And because you're not seeing that in the fantasy and sci-fi side, you don't think that about the individuals playing those games. So I challenge you, if you're looking out from the outside looking in, of wargaming in general, to think about, all right, do I know enough? And like we talked about earlier, just because someone is doing those historical games doesn't mean they agree with it. Just like I would assume that someone playing a chaos army whose sole goal is skulls for the skull throne or blood for the blood god, whatever it might be, doesn't personally believe that in their everyday life. I mean, I would think most people would think that's absurd. So why should it not be considered absurd looking at the historical wargamer? And then the other side, looking at, our non-historical war gamers looking in over at the historical war gamers, the same thing isn't, I'm not looking across the fence thinking you believe those things on a personal level. You identify with those things at the factions that you're playing as. I mean, even the Imperium, who's a lot of people think is the good guys because they're the humans, they do some really terrible things within that universe. I don't feel like those players feel that way. And so I would challenge, our non-historical wargaming brethren, when you look at the historical wargaming side, is to think of it that way as well. We're both playing games. You are very knowledgeable about the universe in which your game takes place, and we are very knowledgeable about the universe in our game takes place. Our game takes place in this universe, I'll have you know. And so, maybe a little bit of a dig here, but
well, I think there's
there's truth to that.
That's a very I think that's a very articulate way to, I think, put that. I think that this ties back into the controversial conflicts as well, in the sense that proximity seems to be the guiding, not, if you take symbology and depraved acts off the table, or whatever's happening on the tabletop, proximity seems to be the guiding light in where controversy and the tabletop intersect. And even with historical wargamers and the examples that we gave about proximity to the conflict, people that wanted to scoff at why people wouldn't play a historical war game, but then they came back and said, well, I don't want to play that period because I actually served in it, or it's too real for me. There were a lot of issues and concerns there. But then when you got to, for fantasy and future fantasy, it seemed to be like, well, there's no proximity at all. It's all make believe, so it's just kind of cut and dry. And I think that is, that's a dangerous view to be all or nothing on that. There's obviously some things about fantasy and future fantasy that I wouldn't want to, experience or give reverence to. But I think, it goes back to your sense of us as historical wargamers. This is how we're looking at our own period, our own human history, and we're not demonizing it. Obviously there's things that we think are extremely wrong with how wars were fought, why people, gave the ultimate sacrifice in their lives for these ideas that, you, myself, and I think a vast majority of historical wargamers would say were pointless, were, bad in a sense, and should never exist again. But the most interesting thing about, I think, this to maybe me and you and other historical wargamers are this universe, like you said, that phrase is worth its weight in gold, is our universe, and it's part of human history. And so there's a sense of a reverence and respect on why these things divulged in the way they did, why they happened, why they led to these conflicts that I think future fantasy and fantasy kind of hide behind, in the sense of this happens on our tabletop, but it's make-believe, it's all in my head. That I think is maybe not disingenuous, but a way to kind of draw a line from what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, that I just think is, I don't want to say erroneous, but I think is maybe not planted in a constructive way to view tabletop wargaming, whether it be fantasy or historical. But these are all, super great points in that. What other, points or any other comments do you have on those and the past for fantasy and future fantasy?
Yeah, I think really that kind of sums it all up. That we're not. So this whole podcast is that we want to be advocates for this side of the hobby, and we have every respect for our brothers and sisters on the other side of the hobby. And so we're not saying that because you don't historical war game, you're somehow bad. What we're just addressing is those amongst you who have these issues we've listed before, that if you're just as guilty about some of these views as those who are alien to wargaming, then we ask and caution you to reevaluate some of them. But we also want to acknowledge that and something that you should acknowledge on the other side of the fence is that you all guys often get a pass on a lot of these things that the historical wargamers don't, when if we were all being honest and fair, they probably shouldn't. Like if what we were doing had legitimate problems, then the non-historical side would probably be guilty of the same problems. And so, that we're really one big wargaming family, and so we shouldn't look down at each other. We should have respect for each other. And so I just want to make sure that we convey that neither of us, neither of us are trying to come across as saying somehow you are beneath us or lesser than. Just that the beliefs and the misunderstandings about this side of the hobby is our goal to clear up. Does that make sense?
No, I think that's halfway through. I think our final section, you did a fantastic job, I think, kind of wrapping that up. And so, leading us into wrapping this up, I think, your last few sentences, are it. I think that it's showing us that, we all do, I think, have a personal line that we don't want to cross. And I don't think, where I play a game where I'm rolling a dice to do any kind of, killing somebody on the tabletop or taking away that model, is making me, a warmonger, or to some sense I'm kind of steeped in this history. I'm trying to give credit to it, to, this is our universe, like you said. And some of the most interesting and fascinating stories I've read about in human history really happened. You know, they didn't happen on a distant planet somewhere. They didn't happen on a, but these were actual people who lived, and that most historical wargamers have an immense respect and reverence for the period, you know, the conflict, and the people that they're wargaming. They opposed views of, you know, turning a blind eye to human history and human nature is a dangerous road, in my mind, you know, that can lead to censorship, stifling of education, and more than likely a disconnect of why these conflicts occurred, and how we're destined, as we said earlier, to repeat them when people, you know, kind of stop having these educated and respectful kind of conversations and discourse. And so, you know, those are my final thoughts kind of for wrapping up the whole controversial topic. Is that's really what I feel about it. You know, I myself, you only got one life to live, and the people that have come before me and the people that'll come after me will probably know conflict in one way or another. And whether I'm trying to get myself into the roles of that small unit level commander for that period or that time, or I'm steeped in, you know, how did these even nations form? What were they fighting for? What was the left and right limits? And then how did they come to get these ideas and their ideologies of conquest and all of those things? And that is the most interesting part of historical wargaming for me. It really did exist, to some degree. It really did happen. And I know historical wargamers, you know, some do disconnect from that and say, well, we're playing make believe, we're trying to put it in the period or the setting, but at the end of the day, this is, you know, a war game, and so that's how they disconnect from it. But I do lean into the history to know where my fellow man came from and where we're going, and that's where I see myself as, you know, maybe in bold, a historical in bold slash wargamer. And maybe wargamer isn't in bold in the sense of that's where my passion and those things lie to it. And, you know, for just to kind of echo back, that's where my line is for me personally. And for somebody that has a misgiving or misunderstanding of it, please start the conversation with me. Let me know what your thoughts are, where you stand, where you see yourself, kind of what are your issues or concerns, or the controversial stuff that the line is that you can't get through. Let's start that conversation, and let's learn about our past, you know, and maybe that'll show where we're going. Kind of wrapping up to throwing it back to you for your final thoughts on it. Let me know what you think, what Wyndehust sees as all of this controversial topic, you know, coming to a head.
Yeah. So as Wyndehust Productions, my biggest experience with dealing with the controversy within historical wargaming, I can sum it up this way: it's only political if you make it political, and most wargamers aren't coming at it from that perspective. And so if you're posting stuff, like if you're posting, you know, your Confederate force or your Crusaders or your German army, if you're posting it being like, oh, you know, I just finished this army and I'm painting it, you know, if you're not making it political, then you're fine. You're not part of the problem. And nobody else should be going out there and trying to make it political, you know, especially not other war gamers. I think it is in this modern age, we have, you know, something we say in the military a lot is perception is reality, right? And so this is a message to my fellow historical wargamers. We have to be our own best advocates. So you should not be out there posting on somebody else's post about their Crusaders, like, oh, we should send them here for this or that reason, or, you know, glorifying this or that faction, because there's just no need for it. It doesn't add to the game. It doesn't add to the hobby. You know, you can glorify the paint job someone does on how good it looks, how historically accurate it is. You can glorify the victory you have on the table, regardless of the faction you play. But it's only political if you make it political. And if we want less controversy about our hobby, then we have to be the advocates for it. And that's kind of where I'd wrap up my thoughts on it.
No, that's great. And so hopefully we've done that through this conversation, through the lens of being respectful. Once again, our little kind of caveat to this is, we came at this in the idea of hopefully everybody would have the mirror, kind of slowly go towards, what their purpose in the hobby, what they're getting out of the hobby, and where people, through their own means, don't want to connect with each other, and don't want to have that discourse or that conversation, and things can obviously be taken out of context. Whether you're a warmonger or you believe with that ideology because you've painted an army, which is you painted them merely to be the enemies to the army, that you had. And so that's something, as long as we can always keep that kind of respectful discourse going, that will hopefully illuminate to some of the people who are on the fringes of both sides on why they can't talk and connect with each other. And that's our ultimate goal. So hopefully we've achieved that. If we have said anything that offends, please let us know. If you want to disagree with a viewpoint, please let us know. Just like Wyndehust has said in the past, like this is our goal: is we want the criticism, we want the feedback, and we want to know your own personal kind of ventures into these levels of controversy and what you've seen on the tabletop. Let us know of a rule set that had a controversial act or something that happened on the tabletop, but maybe you thought pushed the envelope or was too far, or maybe you didn't think was far enough. Let us know the controversial conflict, that you've wargamed, that you've had to illuminate to other people, or that you felt like, maybe I'm not getting anything out of this war game. I need to know, and vice versa with models on the tabletop, even to so much as you won't game that because based on the respect and reverence you want to give human life. We want your comments. We want them all. We want you to please give us the feedback, whether you private message either one of us, post on the On Patrol Facebook group, on our YouTube, anything. We look forward to it, and we look forward to continuing this discussion with you in the future. Wyndehust, I'll head it back to you for a little bit of a lighter topic now, since that was pretty heavy, with kit bag.
Yep. So
go ahead, Wyndehust.
Everybody knows the last two segments we like to do is kit bag and then our scouting report. So for kit bag this month, we want to talk about roads. So I first only ever had homemade roads. So I had like MDF ones for paved roads, and I had like caulking material on like plastic for my dirt roads. Then I had, when I finally got some, teddy bear fur mats, they had some integrated roads in them. And just recently, actually yesterday, as of the day of we were recording, I received my first pre-made roads from Playmats. They're like neoprene, like mousepad material. I got a set of their asphalt roads and a set of their dirt roads in 15 millimeter scale, which actually go really well with 20 millimeter, and they'll be getting used in that modern project I've kind of been working on. So yeah, those are my roads in the kickbag. Kentuckian, what's your thought on roads and what you're using?
Yeah, roads is huge for any wargamer, historical or not. I think that, when you talk about mats and a 6x4 mat or whatever the mat is you play with, or whether it's a felt sheet from Hobby Lobby, that's great. It can give a lot of value to your tabletop. But when you talk about roads, man, it just can, magnify your games and what you can put on there. Well, is it a crossroads? Is it going across a few undulating pieces of terrain? And then why is it important? We always see armies kind of marching to each other on roads. My two roads of choice that I have huge groups in my collection are going to be, there's a company out of North Carolina that I normally use for tabletop terrain. And then there is, I think, Battlefront. It uses the Gale Force 9, the rubber roads, is just massive. For me, those are mainly designed for Flames of War, but they fit well with 25 millimeter and plus. You can connect them. The pieces hold up pretty well. I think I've had like one piece break because of weather. It was left in a colder container. And then the company in North Carolina is Tabletop Terrain Concepts. It is just awesome. It is, they're used out of that rubber material. It allows you to kind of put them over terrain and mask them. And our Battlefield, I apologize, Battlefield Terrain Concepts, I think is the name of that company. I want to make sure I'm doing them justice. It's Battlefield Terrain Concepts. They make very flexible roads. I think they're out of some type of rubber material. I can use them. They sell a variety of different widths for 28 and 15 millimeter and smaller and larger. And they are just awesome. Help to bring your battlefields to life, and then allow you to make so many different battlefields when you can connect these roads. And whether you're fighting over an urban area with a lot of roads, or maybe a farm with a road running through that allows troops to take advantage of it. Roads should be in every historical wargamer or wargamer's kit bag because it just helps us. And so we wanted to mention a few of our different road types and what we use to help us kind of give us a variety of games, as well as allow us to add another dimension to our war games. I'll kick off the next spot that we were talking about is our scouting report. It's our next section. Always ends up kind of in the end. I called Wyndehust out for his ability to pick up other things in the hobby at the initial onset of this episode. What's in my scouting report? My gulls have stayed on my tabletop since Wyndehust was here, which was several weeks ago. They have not moved. A brush has not touched them. They are very isolated and alone right now and afraid on my hobby space. I have, if you follow my page, I have really started into the 101st Airborne. I have almost 100 paratroopers primed with some vehicles and weapons primed, based, and put all the basing material on them. And I've started to paint skin and some stuff on those. Again, shout out to the people that gave me a lot of help on, trying to be historically accurate to the unit I'm part of now, but also getting me to help, paint them and the techniques that they've used. There's a guy in Chicago, Seamus, who's part of the Chicago Bolt Action Group. He has come up with a painting guide for World War II Airborne that is beyond, nobody can touch it. It is an amazing painting guide. He's helped me out along the way. So I really look forward to getting those in as my scouting report. So probably, hopefully before the end, I'm about to be out of town for 2 weeks, but before mid-February, I can get my little 250-point force painted, and then I can also, start to get some games in as we begin our league in February, maybe before our next episode. Recently got some more Hail Caesar in with my old man came and stopped in for a little bit. I was able to get some additional games. Really enjoyed the games that me and Wyndehust played over there, so I look forward to kind of keeping Hail Caesar in the background, getting back to those Gauls whenever I can. But as far as what we had talked about in December, I am failing miserably at getting stuff painted on my scouting report, and I'll be out of town for a week, come back, and then go to a different state the next week. So I'm going to have to pull some Wyndehust tactics and maybe take some stuff with me to continue to get it finished. But I'm going to be struggling as we go into February and my hobby time. But hopefully I've got some models painted in the next episode and some more games played. What about you, Wyndehust? What's on your scouting report?
Yep. So, I had put up to the community, should I start this year with World War One or with French-Indian War? World War One won out, and so I dutifully got them all out and got them all primed, and then abandoned them. Well, I didn't abandon them. They got shifted back because a little bit before I had received that a large, not order, but a gift from a wargamer who just likes the stuff I post, sent me the Waterloo French Army set epic from Warlord, as well as like 8 boxes of infantry and cavalry, heavy and light cavalry. And I'll be honest, up until I received those, I had never intended on getting into Napoleonics because I've got enough other stuff to do, and it's such a popular period that I can probably always find a game with people who have enough stuff for me to play. But I have a video that goes in more detail up on my page. But in just a quick synopsis, I'm doing a fundraiser with it to raise money for the MS Society here in the UK, multiple sclerosis. I think I'm saying that right.
Sclerosis.
Yeah.
We're going to butcher it. MS, anyways.
MS. And so with that, because I never thought I'd do Napoleonics, I've also been very blessed with the community. I joined a couple Facebook groups for the period and just got outpourings of support and advice and suggestions and feedback, because I want to do them, justice. And I'm really learning a lot about the period already, even just in unit composition and stuff. So that's been pretty cool. I'm going to try and split it up occasionally with working on the Germans. I've got a batch on my table here, already primed and Zenithal highlight, so I can get some testing in, because I haven't painted on my Germans, World War Germans, for, maybe nearly a decade. So I kind of got to relearn what colors I'm going to use. But yeah, apart from that's pretty much going to take me through the middle part of the year at least.
Lots of painting ahead for both of us. That's going to be pretty rough. We hope, we hope we can stay with it on our scouting reports. Hopefully you follow us on our page, give us the encouragement, the words of encouragement or shame to help keep us motivated. Me and Wyndehust do a good job messaging each other. But look forward to hearing from you guys. Again, feel free, post on Patrol on what's on your scouting report, what's on the head for you, where you're taking things, and be sure to give us all the advice and critiques and criticisms for painting and getting our hobby on the straight and narrow and on azimuth. Really just, again, appreciate everybody's listens to this. Friendly reminder, please comment. Please keep the discussion going forward on how we can all get on the same page, where our lines are at in controversial wargaming, and how we can maybe level the communications to make sure that we're all staying true to what our purpose is in the hobby and what we wanted to get out of it, as well as being mindful of other people and hopefully even bringing them into Wyndehust, as he said, our ultimate goal in historical wargaming. So that's it from us. We look forward to the next episode with you guys. Can't wait to be with you again, and hopefully we've got more games played, more armies and units painted, and we're not just sitting here like a bump on a log again. Or at least I am. Wyndehust is just cranking away at this Napoleonics, but I've got about 5 models to show for my first month's effort into 2024. So truly appreciate it. Look forward to the next one. And in the meantime, grab your spear, your shield, your musket, or your belt-fed machine gun and join us on the next episode of On Patrol. Out.